But we didn't bail on web components because we did believe that the standards would eventually go through. And when V1 came out, we made a huge jump to Polymer 2. And fast forwarding in time, we have now moved to the new component, the new library lit element. This is a storybook. It's going to show just really quickly a bunch of components that we have, and we have hundreds of web components at this point. They do various things, and they are composed to make bigger pieces of UI. This is using lit element, and these web components are extremely performant, and they work in almost every browser. But had we not stuck with it, and had we jump ship for React or for Angular or for Vue, it would have actually made our lives a lot harder. And that's kind of our story. It's not everyone's story, but I do want to explain why I think that this was the right choice for Vernier. And that's because Vernier is constantly creating new applications in new environments and has to move with wherever education is moving. So we went to Chromebooks, but Chromebooks were using this thing called packaged apps. Google gave up on that, and now they're just trying to add new APIs to the open web. We don't really care if it works or not, but we do have to be there. We have to meet the users where they are. And for us, being able to write components that can survive years down the road is really important so that we can continue to build new products. These components here, they do various things. We interface with USB devices, and we interface with Bluetooth. And I'm not saying that all those are standards. Some of them come from wrappers, and some of the APIs come from other things. But in the end, the presentation layer is all based on web components. When you have a small team of 3 developers creating multiple products and then exploding that out to consume our counterparts of iOS and Android apps, it was really important to be able to quickly shift and move wherever we needed to move. Vernier saw the power of web components, and they also saw the speed of web components, and because of that, we discontinued any native app production in order to build just web component-based architecture for everything, which is kind of a big deal. And we've so far created about 4 applications that stand alone, and they range from PWAs to Mac or Windows or Linux applications, all wrapped likely in Electron. And so those are some of the apps that we have out right now. But the thing about web components that I want to get to is that there was a massive learning curve. I don't think this is the case anymore because it's so much better now. 2019 is an awesome year to build for web components because there are libraries like Lit Element. You can use Stencil, and there's a ton of other ones that they're maybe not as popular, but they accomplish the same goal, that you can build reusable components that work in any framework that you're trying to build your application in. But I did want to highlight a couple of things that really bothered us, that was really difficult for us, and it starts with the Shadow DOM. I mentioned it once before, but Shadow DOM is a big learning curve, especially for a web designer. You're used to being able to build an application and theme your entire application by just using a cascade. That's not the case exactly. And so for us, it was really tough. I'll get into it a little bit more. The other thing was, especially early on, if you typed into Google, how do I do something with web components or the library that you're using, you would find results, but they would always be real cryptic. And it'd be really hard to get the answers you're looking for. So when you have a team of developers who are used to relying on Google searches for being able to answer questions to problems that you're having, and all of a sudden that the answers you get back are really minor, or there's very few of them, it starts to feel really isolating. And the last part was building complex applications with web components was really difficult because nobody was really talking about how to do it. Google was really awesome about talking about how to build a standalone component and put it somewhere or into any framework. That's been something they've been talking about for years. But how do you build an entire application with web components when no one talks about it? Then you have to rely on your own ideas. And sometimes when you're 3 devs, that's a really small world. So Shadow DOM, I talked about it a little bit. One of the designers that we had who was really, I would say really good with CSS, just couldn't take it. He just hated it. And he would tell me every day, why do we use this library? Why do we have to have the Shadow DOM? Is there a way to turn off using the Shadow DOM with a component? And the answer was you could, but we really didn't want to, because when you start creating an application and you are forced to encapsulate pieces of your application, you kind of just write it better. We know that. And so it was a huge learning curve, though, to tell our designer, like, you're going to have to figure out how to deal with it. And so we tried to write tooling to be able to pull styles in, and it was okay. But it wasn't until we actually went to Lit Element, which at this point, we've only completed our massive transition in the last couple of months, that our web designer said, I love working with the Shadow DOM. I love how this works. And some of that has to do with the way that our tooling worked. This is just a really clipped version of what the code looks like, but in Lit Element, you have the ability to have this static styles method, and in there you can have just like a block of CSS. People have seen it probably. You use tag template literals, and it's a CSS block that you can actually inject there, and it's super awesome and it works super well, except for when you're trying to use Sass. All of our apps were written using Sass, and so we had to figure out a way to deal with that. And ultimately, it actually wasn't that bad. You can see it here, and I wish I would have put the tooling. We use rollup to roll up all of our components at the app level, but all we do is just compile Sass, and then we just throw it into a tag template literal with the CSS tag name, and we inject it into the component, and then it builds that up. And if you're using a browser that uses constructible style sheets, this is a thing that allows you to really have like a single style sheet as a reference to that other components can reference, rather than having to duplicate it. So when we implemented this, we saw a huge reduction in how much CSS we were shipping, which was really awesome. And on top of that, we didn't have to deal with the CSS and JS model. We could simply put these 2 lines here, have an external Sass style sheet, and write your template as normal. And at the end of the day, it would just inject that CSS as a constructible style sheet. Super awesome, and we love it. And more importantly, the designer loves it. And that was really nice. It made our lives much easier. Just because he had been frustrated for so long and dealt with it, and now we could give him something that he actually wanted to do. The other part of this, though, is the isolation, feeling like you don't have anywhere to look for answers. This isn't actually accurate. If you do Google that, you'll find a lot. But I thought it was funny because this is sort of what it felt like for a long time. How do I do this certain thing with web components, with Polymer? And that's not really the case anymore. If you do Google things, the awesome thing is that Ionic, with Ionic 4, they released all of their components as web components using Stencil. So they compile all of their components down to web components at the end of the day. But what that means is that, especially for a company that has to use something like Cordova, and we're using web components, when you Google something, Ionic usually has run into this problem. And so we found a lot of answers there. We didn't have to try to put pieces together where, like, well, here's a problem that React has, and here's a problem that Polymer people have, and maybe we can merge those. You can actually typically find the answers you're looking for. With Lit Element and Stencil and I'm forgetting other ones, but there's a lot of component libraries now that are built on top of web components that people are using, and they're using in production. And there's even big companies that are starting to use these. And so when you're looking for an answer to to a problem, you can find it. And that is a huge win for your developer experience. So this was a problem, and really in 2019, I feel like it's pretty much gone. I was planning on talking about complex applications with web components prior to this talk. And I had already started writing this talk based very similar to this talk that Justin Fignani from Google Polymer team gave only, I think, like a month or a month and a half ago. That URL, if you're trying to write full full applications with web components, you have to watch this, because if you have been doing that, hopefully you'll feel like we did, where we felt like we had been really close to how other people were viewing it and how other people thought it could be done. And if you're not, hopefully you can make some minor tweaks and jump on something or take some of the hints that are given here. It's really awesome. The things that he talks about in that talk are things like dependency injection, which is something we had to deal with for a long time, how you do dependency injection with web components. And we came up with models that looked close to maybe frameworks, but at the end of the day, Justin's suggestion is pretty awesome. So I would recommend using that one. Also, we had to do things like state management and figure out how to handle your state, your application state, with tools like Redux. And over the years, this has just become much easier. Companies like Vaadin are creating tutorials that can help you. And I've used them, and they're all great. And guess what? They're simple. That's one of the big wins that I want to take away from this whole thing. Whether you're using a web component at a very small level just to work cross-framework, or you're using web components at an application level, when I look at our code today, it's actually really simple and easy to understand. If you're not an expert at web components, you should be able to come into a code base using web components and say, I understand what's going on here. And that's what's so cool. If you've ever looked at something like the actual HTML element and how you would construct a custom element, or a custom element using Shadow DOM or without, it's just a class that extends the base class of HTML element. If you're using some libraries, they're so simple that you just swap out your base element for something like lit element, like we're doing, and then you just get some awesome sugaring on top, where you can have your render method right in next to your component logic. I'm talking only about lit element because it's where we have the most experience. We have looked at other component libraries or component libraries built on top of web components, but for us, lit element was awesome. And Polymer, while it did serve its purpose, lit is leaps and bounds above what we had from Polymer. It seems so much easier, and it is very similar to what many developers are writing for things like JSX style. So that's kind of our journey. And so the takeaway that I really want to give is you can write applications or straight up single components that work everywhere, as we saw, and you can do it today either using HTML, extending just the HTML element, lit element, or you can use something like Stencil, which would actually give you an even easier component, kind of I would say like a Vue-esque style way of writing web components that would compile down to web components. There's a lot of options. And so you can look into those options and get involved with the community, because if you look at the Polymer channel on Slack, or if you look at even on Twitter and you just hashtag web components, you're going to find a lot of people. I missed a really important slide, which is a group of people called the OpenWC. Open-WC.org. I wish I would have thrown this slide in there. If you're looking at best practices, this is the place to look, because they are a group of people who are extremely passionate about web components, and they are extremely helpful. If you go to the Polymer channel on Slack, there's actually a sub-channel called OpenWC, and you can find a ton of answers to questions you might have, and you can just feel free to ask questions there. So on the topic of questions, I want to leave a little bit of time for you to ask questions about what I've been working on, and hopefully I've answered some of those already.
Thanks so much. So anyone has any questions? Raise your hand and I'll give you a microphone.
Thank you. Hi there. So I guess this goes with random components in the aspect that, for example, in React, they have a component, but maybe it doesn't have accessibility, right? I guess the same thing could happen for components, web components. So how has your approach been regarding that?
Yeah, so a lot of people out of the gate, I think, have looked at components and thought, hey, you know, the select element is horrible and I can write my own select element. And everyone tries to do that. And unfortunately, that isn't necessarily the best approach. Wherever possible, we try to still use built-in browser components because you're gonna get the best accessibility from that. But if you have to go beyond that, we try to do that, obviously being very careful. You really have a duty when you're writing a component to make sure it's still accessible. So for us, especially in the education field, we don't want to exclude anyone. So we have had to be very careful about how to do that. There's a couple of talks that I could probably point you to that kind of help you with that. Used to be a series by somebody, I can't remember his name, Rob Dodson. He's a Google employee, and he had a whole accessibility webcast. But prior to that, he was doing a lot of Polymer casts. So he at some point had a crossover where he kind of talks about how to accomplish both, and it's a lot of work. I think there's some new kind of proposals for making this a lot easier. And I don't know if you've seen any of the talks from the Chrome Dev Summit, but I think both Microsoft and Google are really working on a nice way to kind of make it so that you can style the actual native elements in a better way. And so you don't have to go and make your own style component or make your own checkbox just because you want it to look better. Instead, you can use the native one, which you're going to get all that built-in accessibility for out of the gate. So I would really caution not to go and try to recreate the components that already exist. The elements that you have out there, they are accessible and they're getting more accessible. So if you are going to do that, you have to tread really lightly because it is a lot of work to build in the amount of accessibility that they have from the native ones.
And if you guys want to learn more about the work that Google and Microsoft are doing to improve the select component and others, go on YouTube, find Chrome Dev Summit 2019 and the talk that's called HTML is not done. This is exactly where you will learn more about it. Any more questions?
So over the course of how web components have evolved over the years, how has your automated testing strategy changed, and what have you kind of arrived at?
That's a super good question. This was so hard to do in the beginning, and our poor automation engineer really put a lot of effort into making it work. Originally, we had end-to-end testing, and we had an automation engineer who I think they're using like Selenium and Chrome WebDriver and things like that. And I'm not an automation expert, so I'm throwing some words out there that maybe, or some terms that might be wrong, but bear with me. The big thing that was really difficult was trying to actually drill down into a component so that you could do things like click. And it used to be a lot easier because in JavaScript, you could just use this deep combination that would allow you to pierce into that. So they actually ended up eventually writing, I think something just like a little utility that I think possibly they give it like an element name, and then they have to it just continues to recursively look through the shadow roots, and that's not real fun. But at the end of the day, they were able to encapsulate all that into just like a 10-line utility that was pretty easy. And we have pretty massive code coverage with our end-to-end tests from the automation engineer, but this is like a massive ongoing thing that they have to do. I wouldn't say that now it's necessarily so much the web components, but for multiple years, it was every stand-up, we can't get this thing to work. That has become much, much better, especially with just these tools that are actually supporting shadow root shadow roots out of the gate. I'm just saying shadow roots because that's always the problem. And so I think I can't remember the name of it. Like I can't remember the name of it, but there's a couple that like are newer and that they're a lot better than, to me, they seem a lot better than Selenium. And they actually like came out with shadow support from the get-go. I think it's also way better because things like Ionic, when they started using this, then a lot of people had to realize that this is a real thing. But with that, there's a lot that just opens up a whole can of worms about whenever you are looking for something like a library, you want to make sure that shadow, if you want to use like a polyfill, make sure that it supports shadow roots. Honestly, that's where the trouble always comes from. But we have overcome it. I would love to have our automation engineer put something out to the public so they can see what we've done, because I think it's some really good work, and I'll try to get that.
Maybe we can have him here next time.
That'd be cool.
Any more? All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.